this crisis of the traditional labor history, there are many reasons that you can give. One, I think that there are great empirical problems in the idea of a secular rise of wage labor that perhaps were apparent always, but become very starkly apparent in the 1980s. Well, we can mention many of these empirical problems. So take household labor, unpaid household labor. There was one point in the early 19th century when Marx and Engels, for example, Engels in the making of the English working class, he predicts that the working class household will disappear. Right? Pro-standardization will mean that sort of everyone will work for a wage, and the household will be impossible to maintain. The late 19th century, of course, sees a fundamental reversal of the trend and a reinstatement of the household as an essential part of the functioning of society, and thereby the maintenance of household labor as a key component in any sort of system. So that is one that goes back a long way. But for the 1980s, then added to that is the crisis of industry in exactly those countries that were supposed to be sort of the advanced capitalist countries. The example of the secular trend towards industrial labor. There's the return towards many different systems of self-employment at the core of the labor market. The growth of megacities in the global south is accompanied with the growth of informal labor at a massive scale. So there's empirical problems. There's of course a crisis by the late 1980s and certainly the early 1990s in beliefs in certain trajectories of progress that were strongly bound up with sort of the earlier successes of the Soviet Union and things like that. There's a crisis in beliefs that definitely affect labor history as well. And there's also the very powerful critiques formulated in the Global South. I want to mention just two, but of course they are part of a far wider trend. Sami Amin, in his Eurocentrism in 1989, says Marx shared the excessive optimism of his time. He believed that capitalist expansion was irresistible and that it would rapidly suppress all vestiges of early modes of production, as well as the social, cultural, and political forms associated with them. In a word, that this expansion would homogenize global society on the basis of a generalized social polarization, bourgeois versus proletariat, similar from one country to the next. So, for Amin, who unfortunately died, of course, last year.
2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago.
No.
This year. Yes, a couple of weeks ago.
Quelques mois. For him, the status of labor history was very central to his critique of Eurocentrism. The same, of course, was for the work of is true for the work of Dipesh Chakraborty, who actually, the quote that I give is a direct challenge to E.P. Thompson, who he greatly appreciated for his writing, but asking the question if the continuity of the English working class and their sort of formation of their ideas is this carrying over of English traditions of freedom and English liberalism into the traditions of the working class. Where does that leave India that does not have these sort of European liberal traditions? Asking and thereby challenging the notion that workers all over the world, irrespective of their cultural past, experience capitalist production in the same way. So the existence of these critiques was very important for the kind of formulations that Marcel van der Linden and Jan Lucassen came to from the early 1990s onward, in which always the idea was that to rewrite this labor history in a global way, one of the key terms would be to include colonial labor history, not as this sort of this template against which to put the perennial rise of the European working class, but as an integral part of how labor relations are formed. So in the summing up of their program at the end of the 1990s, not coincidentally, I think called Prolegomena for a global labor history. The Prolegomena is of course a very strange word, but they take up the title of Ibn Khaldun's famous work, that they say the limitations of the old synthesis become painfully visible when we shift our focus away from the industrializing part of Northwest Europe, or when we examine earlier periods of labor history. Dated and localized assumptions, for example regarding the logical connections between the rise of capitalism and free wage labor, are thus a very considerable hindrance to analysis. Our central question therefore is, how can we study the global development of labor throughout history without implicitly using a particular interpretation of part of European history as a model? This was not merely their own intellectual project. They tried to connect that to shifting the direction, for example, of the institute and of the journal that they were then heading. So you see not, of course, a sufficient shift, but at least if you compare this to the table before, a market shift to including colonial labor history as a topic, and significantly starting to publish writers from the global south, who had been there, of course, for a long time, but often did not penetrate journals in the West, and certainly did not penetrate the review and labor history journals more generally. Generalizing from this work, they came up with a specific tool to study labor history, which is this taxonomy, and I know that you can't read what is over here, so I have enlarged versions of segments later, but I first want to give you the entire idea. So the basic idea is, if we want to understand labor history not from this preset pattern and this stereotype distinction between free and unfree, we have to understand the many varieties that labor relations can take, and the starting point of understanding many varieties is some sort of a taxonomy. It's some sort of a language to talk about the different categories and intermediary categories that exist. Of course, the taxonomy is never an end point of an investigation, but it might be a starting point for asking certain questions. So in a way, the starting point is the total population. Who are sort of the potential workforce. But that already, like any taxonomy, has big problems. Total population already is a very difficult problem. Because if we then divide this into units, we are often back to the nation state as the unit within we see the total population. But of course, we have to start somewhere. So total population is the starting point. And then there's a division in types of work depending on the type of exchange that people involved in, where they created 4 basic categories. Those who do not work, of course, are an important part of the total population, although they are not part of the workforce in general. In every society, there are substantial amounts of reciprocal labor that often fall outside the scope of any comparison in terms of labor relations, but substantial parts of work take place within the household, within communities, and are exchanged without any form of formal remuneration, as something that is sort of part of just living together. Tributary labor for the state, is a crucial element, or labor for equality. And then, of course, when we come to capitalism, the question becomes one of commodified labor. But the category here itself is already, commodified labor is of course much broader than wage labor because commercial slavery is a form of commodified labor. On the basis of this separation, they came to quite an elaborate scheme of 18 forms of different labor that are then part of, that fall under these subcategories. And I won't run through all of them, but I'll just show them to you. And of course, there's an arbitrary element in any attempt to make such a subdivision. But the usefulness emerges once we start asking questions to the taxonomy. So among those who do not work, there's of course a stark division between those who are unemployed, but who can basically also be seen as this, well, in the classical term, the reserve army of labor, who are sometimes employed and sometimes pushed out of employment. There's those who absolutely cannot work, the very old and the very young, but what is very old and who is very young differs a lot in between towns and places. There's the very rich who do not want to work and do not have to work because they can afford it. Now, households are very complex units of analysis for labor relations as well. Let's speed this up. That is even more so for labor for the state and labor for the market. Can you read the table? Where there's enormous amounts of variety. Take slavery, for example. Just take slavery. In the later phases of slavery, we know that there are many forms in which slaves are rented out by their employers to work for the market. Do not simply give their labor to the slave owner, but actually remunerate the slave owner through their own wage. So the table helps us to understand these many different forms. Wage labor is not a single, simple category, right? Among the category of wage laborers, you can have sharecroppers, people can work for a piece rate, people can work for a time rate, and all these things matter a lot for how people labor, how people resist the impositions on their labor made by the employer. So the basic function of making these delineations is that we now have the tools for measuring, starting from the total population, tools for measuring how people work and how the labor force is divided in different societies over time. So taxonomy can then be a basic starting point. It gives us the crude material, but the real questions, of course, that is, how do we explain movements through this table? And movements through the table can take very different forms. One question is that almost everyone in their lives will go through a variety of labor relations, and probably in their and often people combine different labor relations. So 15th century farmers in the northern Netherlands would work on the land for some time, would then in off season would hire themselves out and would be wage laborers on fishing boats. People would do a bit of wage labor for some of the time and be household laborers for another element of their time. So people individually move through these labor categories, and of course that links to the previous to more than one of the previous talks, because migration also is an essential way in which people move, not just between countries, but between various forms of employment as well. But the other core question is, okay, if we accept that capitalism is not simply a society in which wage labor is generalized, what explains the different clusters of labor relations that characterize different moments in the development of economies, and what explains how these clusters change? I wanted to pause there for a bit because I said already quite a lot, and maybe give some rooms for questions about the table here before I move into the next part.
Where can we?
It's www.historyoflaborrelations.org.
It's available there. Okay.
And you can download a lot of material there. Not only the nice picture of the taxonomy, but the set of definitions behind this, which becomes very important. So, redistributive labors within the households. What is that? Right? In this case, it is people who do community service, for example. So you can find a set of definitions. But maybe most importantly, you can find the data sets that have been finished up to now. So the way the project behind this has been constructed is there's now attempts to create complete national cases of this, subdivisions, divide the entire population on the basis of census records and other kinds of records for the key years 1500, 1650, 1800, 1900, 1950, 2000. And we have quite a number of sets of these complete data for countries on 5 different continents, but of course still insufficient because it's a big enterprise.
So new subcategories can appear. New subcategories or even categories can appear after that.
Yes, it's certainly. So any taxonomy is a proposal, and this one has been workshopped quite intensively. So there's various stages of the taxonomy and changes made in the taxonomy on the basis of new results. But at a certain point, because this is a measuring exercise, partly, you have to say this is the taxonomy because otherwise all the data are based on different perceptions. And as far as we're concerned now, on the basis of testing this in a lot of different case studies, we think that this is relatively comprehensive in being able to capture a lot of complexities in different societies that we see. Any more immediate questions on the data? On the approach? Okay. Then I just want to very briefly say something about, because the basis of the comparison here is still national. But of course the whole enterprise of global labor history is then to use this to break down the methodological nationalism that was embedded in the old school labor history. And to do that, we have to do much more than just comparing different quantitative breakdowns of the relationship between different labor relations in different countries. And I have asked substantive questions about how changes through this, through the table, let's say, how these changes are produced by the way that these different cases are embedded in a global economy, in global patterns. Comparison on a case-to-case basis is important for that. But we also have to move beyond that and think about the questions of connections and how they appear concretely in concrete situations. Now, I want to give two very minor examples of how I try to do that in my own work. Two very different examples that I can only skim. I will say just a few basic things about complicated stories. And the only things that I'll say are to bring out the complications that arise from the global embedding of these cases. So the first case that I want to briefly discuss in this light is slave emancipation in Suriname, the most important Dutch plantation colony in the 18th and 19th century, slave plantation colony on the Guyana coast. That is, for the European powers, of course, famously late in the abolition of slavery, only in 1863, after a long trajectory that in some ways begins in 1814, when the British force the Dutch to abandon the slave trade. And once the slave trade is abolished, the colony of the rulers of the colony of Suriname, the slave owners of the colony of Suriname, start dealing with the question how to maintain this colony and the question of the potential, or from their perspective, the threat of emancipation becomes very real. Now, this has often been studied from a completely internally Dutch or a bilateral Dutch-Suriname perspective. But the basic model of explaining the slowness of Dutch abolition is, for Dutch historians, is the long-term, is the decline of the importance, the economic importance of Suriname to the Dutch economy, and sort of a neglect that emerges from that in parliamentary debates. Which, well, we can go into that. There's a number of strange factors about this explanation, but I won't go into the details. What I want to say is how these debates from the outset were shaped by international factors on a number of different levels. First of all, the comparative aspect, what will happen after slavery, is not something that is imposed by global historians on the materials. And I think that is a point that is more generally valid about doing global history. That it's not that we look at histories, historical trajectories that are essentially local, and we as global historians add something to them by saying that they are global and putting them in that perspective. But the people involved in these processes themselves constantly made comparisons. And that is certainly true for slave emancipation. So, from start to finish, the debates are international. This is true for the very first debate on the ending of the slave trade in the Dutch National Assembly in 1797, in which every single representative in the National Assembly who stands up starts by saying, if we emancipate, or if we stop the slave trade, wouldn't that lead to Saint-Domingue? Right? Saint-Domingue is there in every single speech. But it's certainly true in the many decades after, where the Dutch keenly follow the results of the emancipation of British Guyana and in the French colonies, and basically, they derive their basic question from that: how to make sure that slave emancipation can occur without depleting the source of labor for the plantation. How can we continue plantation production after slavery? So that is always a comparative question. But it's a comparative question that is then added to by the fact that the Dutch themselves are involved in global experimentation with other forms of forced labor in their colonial empire, but not only in their colonial empire. And this can be beautifully illustrated by the fact that the first governor in the West Indies, in Suriname, the first Dutch government who substantially reforms plantation slavery in the 1820s, at the same time is the founder of agrarian colonies for the Dutch poor in the east of the eastern Dutch countryside, and is the person who implements the famous cultivation system in the East Indies. So it's very strange to not tell this as a global story when the core personnel of these government debates are so global in their own careers. But there might be a more substantial level, and that is that when thinking about possibilities for the post-slavery era, these possibilities are continuously shaped by the transformation in global patterns of interactions that take place. Fundamentally, by the emergence of a new option, which is the use of Asian indentured labor, which becomes the major substitute in Suriname for enslaved labor.